Well, hello, everyone. My name is Creon Butler, and I'm the Director of the Global Economy and Finance Program in Chatham House. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to our next discussion, which is going to be about President Trump's economic policies, the implications for the US economy and for the wider world. And we've had, I think, over the last couple of days, an enormous amount of discussion about President Trump's trade policies, but it's very important to remember that this is just one of several components in the president's overall economic strategy. Alongside tariffs, you also have his plans on fiscal policy, the extension of the 2017 tax cuts, potentially more than that. You've also got his approach to public expenditure and the activities of the DOGE in terms of cutting public expenditure. There's also his approach to the labor market in the US and his promises to deport up to 10 million undocumented workers to constrain future migration flows. And then more broadly, there is his approach to, if you like, the US administrative structure, the decisions that have been taken to remove the independence of a wide variety of US federal agencies which have been established by Congress, not up to this point, the Federal Reserve, but we'll see how that goes. And then a whole range of other policies that have impacted on the independence of universities and other key elements within the US economy, including, for example, legal firms. So today what we want to do is, in the context of what's been happening on tariffs, also talk about these other elements. And to do this, we have a brilliant panel here. In Delphi, I have Dame DeAnne Julius, who is a distinguished fellow in Chatham House. She was one of the founder members of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, has had many other distinguished roles. Dame Julius, welcome. We also have online, and I believe, yes, they're all there. We have Janet Henry, who is the Global Chief Economist of HSBC, and has a wealth of experience in looking at global economic issues, I think particularly at times in the past with a focus on Europe and Asia. We also have Korteweg, another colleague of mine from Chatham House, an associate fellow at Chatham House, also a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute. And Rem has focused on European strategy and in particular the interplay between foreign policy, trade, and security policies. And last but by no means least, we have Nathan Sheets, who is the chief economist in Citigroup and has a very distinguished career, both as the director of the Division for International Finance in the Federal Reserve, but also undersecretary in the US Treasury in the Obama years. So we have a brilliant panel. I have to say that both Janet and Rem were hoping to be with us today. They would have been on the panel, but unfortunately the travel disruption prevented them from doing so. However, it's great to have you all online. And Nathan, I wonder if I could start off with you straight away. So I set out, if you like, the broader MAGA agenda in the global economy. Back in November, we had a somewhat similar discussion in Chatham House in which we were looking at that set of policies. Now we are several months on. We know a bit more about what President Trump means when he says things. So how would you look today at the overall picture for the US economy and in particular the short-term outlook? Nathan, over to you.
Thanks, Creon. I think you did an excellent job of articulating the various buckets of policy to think about with President Trump. And candidly, the immigration policy, the fiscal policy is going broadly in line with my expectations. I would have expected there to be a little bit more of an emphasis on deregulation than we've seen. I continue to think of that as a core part of his agenda, and I think that that's still in the pipeline. The DOGE effort has been more aggressive, on the other hand, than I would have expected. And there's likely to be some cost savings associated with that, but perhaps also some disruptions to the effectiveness of government. And I think that's a question that we need to think about. And then finally, the tariffs have been orders of magnitude bigger than what I was expecting, at least in terms of their effects on the economy. I was kind of thinking maybe we get 5, maybe 7 points on the effective tariff rate, which is the average tariff on an import entering the United States. And at the moment, even with the pause, we're looking at 25% effective tariff rate. And without the pause, we would have been well over 30. With lower tariff rates, you can say, oh, they get absorbed into margins and so forth. But it's harder to make that case with these kinds of numbers. So when I put this together, implications for the U.S. outlook, one key word that I want to emphasize is uncertainty. That I think a lot is happening. A lot is happening very, very quickly. How do households and firms respond to that? Well, they want to hit the pause button. They want more information. They're going to wait and see. And in that environment, it induces hesitancy into economic activity. And we're seeing this in the sentiment data. We're seeing this in the confidence data. And I think it poses a significant downside risk to economic activity. Now, finally, if I have to parameterize all of this, I would say you're looking at an effect on balance as a result of all of this. Roughly a percentage point. Can I get to a percentage point and a half? I could lower real U.S. GDP growth over the next year is likely relative to my expectations as the year began. And then similarly, this is a stagflationary policy mix with these high tariffs, a percentage point to percentage point more inflation. So uncertainty, stagflationary kind of shock working its way through, downward risk to growth, and upside to inflation is my expectation.
Nathan, thank you very much. If I could just drill down on one aspect. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion here about the multiple objectives the president has with his tariff policy, but one clearly is to raise more revenue, and this plays into what may be coming down the track in terms of tax cuts and so on. I mean, what is your estimate? I mean, let's take your figures on average tariff rates. What's your estimate of the amount of additional revenue sort of that the US federal government may have, and how does that stack up, if you like, against how much it's going to cost to extend the tax cuts and do various other things in that space?
Depending on where the tariffs land and a number of other factors, the revenue that is likely to be several $100 billion. I think you could easily get numbers $300, $400, $500 billion of new annual tax revenue associated with tariffs at the level that have been articulated. And that can be used to fund additional tax cuts. And to the extent that that happens, that's going to provide some support to economic activity and to growth. But that's going to be a positive demand shock for the economy, more growth, but that's also going to reinforce potentially some of the inflation effects associated with the tariffs. So we got to step back and think about how all of that nets out. Now, another way you could use those revenues, and this is also consistent with the spirit of the DOGE effort, is you could put it toward deficit reduction. And I think that would be very welcome by the markets. Secretary Bevson has said he's going to watch the 10-year Treasury yield, where it's recently been moving in the wrong direction. I think if they took steps to bring down the deficit, that could be very helpful in that respect. So they have some options as to how they deploy these revenues.
Yeah, but it clearly could be a substantial amount. DeAnne, you've heard Nathan's kind of description of the picture in the US. I mean, I guess my first question is, do you broadly agree with what he's saying, or is there anything you would pick out as being, you know, more significant potentially? And then, given that picture, you know, what do you think the implications are going to be for the wider world? Are we going to see, I mean, potentially significant falls in global growth in this coming period? Could we see a global recession even under some scenarios? And how do you think if you like, the non-US central banks are going to deal with this kind of stagflation threat?
Well, I certainly agree with the key words, Nathan, that you picked out, namely uncertainty, which means hesitancy in investment and in spending, indeed, and slower growth than we would have had otherwise, and higher inflation. That stagflationary environment, I think, is a pretty serious one for countries to deal with. And indeed, in terms of the confidence figures in the US, which are really shockingly low, I think we're also going to see whether we get some kind of a political reaction to this. In a way, this kind of shock therapy that the Trump administration has put out will be a bit of a test of the constitutional strength of the United States. You know, will Congress manage to step up to its traditional role, which is as a check on the executive? The checks and balances are a very strong part of the U.S. Constitution, and they haven't been working so far in the first few months of Trump's campaign. I think what could really trigger more of this check on the type of tariff and other policies that Trump has would be if indeed the U.S. slides into recessionary territory. Now, as I understand what Nathan was saying, he's talking about a percentage point off growth. I don't think that would put it into recession. But we could see a much bigger downturn, partly because of what has been happening to the stock market, because of the wealth effect in the United States, and simply because of confidence factors if people are not interested in consuming. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic, I think. In regard to your second question about the world economy, there I think we do have to come back to the tariff situation. You know, the United States is the biggest importer of goods in the world. China is the biggest exporter, although the EU is very close to that number. So we've got the biggest two actors in the trade balance with extremely high tariffs on each other. That probably won't shut off all trade, but it's certainly going to have a major contractionary effect on world trade. Now, of course, there'll be other compensating things that I'm sure we'll talk about, but I foresee that that is going to be quite a big negative shock to the world economy.
Yeah. And if you were another advanced country central bank, so the Bank of England, Bank of Japan, ECB, and you saw this explosion of uncertainty in the global economy, what would you be doing now, aside from trying to gather all the information you can about what's going on?
Well, I think it'll vary country by country.
Right.
I don't think there's one answer. What we have in the United States, if indeed we do have this kind of inflationary shock, I think will prevent the Fed from lowering rates, maybe not lowering them at all, or certainly in a much slower rate that I think the market is currently expecting. In the UK, which I'm the most familiar with, we will also have an inflationary uptick because of the tariffs and because of the tightness of our labor market, but that could change. So I think there too we'll probably see a little bit of cut in rates. They're 4.5 now. We might see them down at 4 by the end of the year. Japan may want to trade off its monetary policy with some help on the trade side because Trump has put extremely large tariffs on Japan, which is, you know, a major strategic ally of the U.S. So there'll probably be a little bit of give and take on some of the other countries.
Thank you.
And in terms of Europe, there's a little more slack. So I imagine that the ECB will probably come down at least one more notch.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Janet, you've heard a sort of perspective from the US and a broader picture. I mean, obviously one of the really important issues is how the president's tariff policies is going to kind of reorder world trade to some extent. There is a real fear in both the emerging world and in advanced countries about the possibility that China, particularly as it's subject to such extraordinarily high tariffs, will redirect trade flows to those other advanced markets. But on the other hand, in the past, we've seen the Chinese authorities, particularly during financial crises in 97 to 99, and then in 2007, 9, actually be what people would describe as kind of responsible in these kind of circumstances. So first of all, what do you think is going to happen in terms of the global pattern of trade flows, and specifically, how do you think China is going to, what kind of role is China going to play in this going forward?
Yes. Well, I guess things have already changed over the course of the last 24 hours, because, by yesterday morning, when the reciprocal tariffs were imposed for a few hours, and the moves in financial markets kind of had everyone freaking out about the idea of a financial crisis and some kind of global recession. Already things have calmed to some degree. But, I would reinforce the whole uncertainty point that I think everyone on this panel will be referring back to, because we have got this 90-day reprieve, but it's only 90 days. And actually, we've not even had 90 days of this administration, so that we know that things can change day to day. But based on what we've got so far, what we know, which is that we've got 125% tariffs on China and a 10% tariff on pretty much everything else, other than 25% tariffs on a whole array of sectors, then actually the big story in the world right now is this massive structural shift regarding the US and China. To some extent, it's been eroding over the course of the last 5 to 8 years, I would say. Certainly when we had the beginning of the tariffs, we've already seen some shift regarding, I guess, Vietnam being used as a lily pad in particular, with that enormous trade surplus that they now have with the US. But even though Vietnam has now only got a 10% tariff, I think there's still a nervousness that we could get bigger tariffs on Vietnam as well. So I think just because we've had this announcement about 90 days, you can't be confident that there might not be more tariffs on more sectors, that companies are not going in the US be able to completely shift their supply chains that have been built up, not just over the last 5 or 8 years, but over the last 30 years, can't be moved in the space of the next 3 months. Or more. So, I think you've got the kind of short-term shift on trade. We've seen a huge front loading in the US. The trade data is going to be very difficult to read after that huge front loading. That may fall back quite sharply. And the China angle is hugely important. We know that there are certain products that make up important parts of supply chains where China makes up 80–90% of the inputs from the US. So yes, maybe you can go to Cambodia and get some of them. Maybe you can go to Bangladesh and get some of them. But you can't replace the China story immediately. And the other point, about what it means for elsewhere. Well, I think it's already clear that over the last year, concerns about China's ultra competitiveness have not just been in the US. We've had tariffs in terms of being imposed by Europe, by Mexico, by Canada, and even by Asian economies. Most Asian economies trade a lot more with China than they do even with the US. And they start from a position of quite low inflation. So whether it's solar panels, electric vehicles, quotas, you are already seeing other countries impose some trade barriers with regards to China. And Europe is an interesting one in this regard, because Europe has made it clear to the US, to some extent they want to be aligned with the US, and to some extent they want to set their own China policy. We've also seen the US use the China angle as being a means of negotiation, whether it's with Mexico and Canada. If perhaps you impose tariffs on China, then we might go a little bit easier with you. So we've got these enormous shifts, this whole reconfiguration of global trade. We're clearly not seeing anything in the way of trade deals globally. It's now much more about the bilateral and the regional. Countries have been scurrying around for ages. Europe signing a trade deal with Latin America, different countries seeking bilateral trading relationships. That's what's all happening at the bigger picture, more structural level. But the new development is this apparent break between the US and China. And while I expect some, maybe some carve-outs, some possibilities of deals, this is a huge severing. And for now, I see, for globally, it's a supply shock. For the US, it's a supply shock. But actually, if other countries allow some disinflationary pressures to come through from Asia, it could actually be quite helpful from an inflationary point of view. And they're obviously also going to be helped by the fallback in the oil price, which also could have implications for what central banks do.
Janet, thank you very much. I mean, just going again on the sort of options facing the Chinese authorities, I mean, one thing they could do is say, well, you know, we're facing these constraints in terms of exports to the US. We could also face constraints vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So we're actually going to double down on the domestic economy. We're actually now going to finally try and grow domestic consumption on a permanent basis, something that many external experts have called on China to do for many years, and which up to this point really hasn't happened. Do you think this could be the thing that changes the economic strategy within China, or are you doubtful about that?
No, I think it is already something that's changed. What we've seen is a continuation of these policies. So far, it hasn't been on the scale of what we saw in 2009. Or indeed what we saw in 2016, when it really was on a massive scale. But there are some big structural challenges, some big headwinds that China had been facing in the property sector in particular. And now this realization that there needs to be much more of a shift towards a consumer-led model, and also perhaps to embrace the private sector a little bit more. There is this big motivation that's come through the DeepSeek news that we've had in recent months. I think you will see a bit more urgency from China. Already we've had announcement not just about trade-in schemes to support lower income consumers or people trading in goods to support consumer spending, but also certain areas in the property market, buying up homes, renting, selling them to lower income people, changing the whole structure of migrant workers. So these are structural stories as opposed to short-term policy stimulus that could help the shift towards consumption and accelerate the whole urbanization process. But I think that you will get more stimulus as well in terms of support to local governments' finances, and also if they can promote the private sector and improve employment prospects, that can mean that Chinese consumers, which still have exceptionally high household savings rates, encourage them to lower their savings rates a little bit. So I think it is a medium-term story, as opposed to we're just going to see a one-quarter bounce because of a big policy stimulus, and it will all be about infrastructure spending or property, like some of the stimulus packages that we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, let's hope that that's how it turns out. Rem, if I could move on to you. I mean, up until the end of 2024, there was a kind of whole trend of countries around the world developing economic security strategies. I mean, it was partly triggered by the pandemic, then the geopolitical tensions and so on. But in a way, you know, the economic security strategies were also linked to industrial strategies, and to some extent in the advanced countries that was kind of new. I mean, well, not necessarily so new in the emerging economies. We've now had a very short period of President Trump, and economic security is as important, if not even more important. But how do you think those strategies now look? Do they still work, or are the countries that have developed them going to have to rethink them in quite a fundamental way, given that, you know, for example, if you were Canada, you have to think about the US as a potential threat to your economic security in a way that you probably never imagined before?
Yeah, thank you very much, Creon, for that question. And also thank you very much for the invitation to join this excellent panel. By asking the question, you're also kind of answering it. I think the main change, as opposed to the pre-Trump economic security strategies, is that the US is now a factor of uncertainty and instability. So the bottom line is that before the Trump presidency, companies and governments were talking about diversification and the creation of China plus one strategies to ensure business continuity and avoid unwanted dependencies. Now what you hear in the corridors of power is, well, we should be thinking of America plus one strategies as well. So that's the big change. But let me just reinforce a couple of things that have been said also by Janet and others, is that yes, we are now facing real uncertainty. We are in a phase of a reconfiguration of global trade ties, and that the US-China tensions, the tariff war, if you will, is now the single most important story that also European capitals, Brussels, the EU is worrying about. And just to highlight that, Europe faces what you could describe as a double whammy. On the one hand, there is now a short-term reprieve of 90 days for US tariffs, but who knows, they might come back on again. And of course, there are already tariffs on the European automobile sector. There might be new tariffs coming with respect to digital services taxes. We don't know. And this reciprocal tariff discussion will not go away. And on the other hand, where is Chinese export now going to go to? Yep. And there is a real risk that that's going to end up on European markets. And so European governments, European businesses are worried about, on the one hand, being priced out of the American market, and on the other hand, facing Chinese dumping in their home markets. And so what do European governments, which I know best, pursue? They pursue the basic tenets of their economic security strategy, which is, first and foremost, focus on the internal market, focus on strengthening the internal market, focus on key technologies like semiconductors, quantum, artificial intelligence, biotech, even defense now these days. Reduce the regulatory burdens within the internal market. It was Mario Draghi and his very influential report that pointed out that if you add everything up when it comes to internal regulatory burdens inside the EU, it amounts to a 44% tariff on intra-EU trade. And trade within the EU is much more important than trade with third countries, even if those third countries are China or the US. So there's going to be a focus more inward through generating more funding for innovation, for research, for reducing dependencies on not just China or Russia, but now also the United States. But there is a very important new accent which is being sort of explored, which is the partnering element of economic security, which is building new trade ties to be able to circumvent or become resilient to any shocks in the system because of the US-China tariff war. And what I expect is that over the next couple of years, we will have a very different debate inside the EU, particularly about trade agreements, whether those are sectoral agreements or plurilateral agreements, that the EU is going to reach out with countries that share their concern about where the rules-based trading order is going towards, and is really going to underline the strategic nature of trade agreements. And I expect that the EU is going to move forward on that, and that also domestic publics are going to accept that trade agreements are a very important part of responding to effectively the protectionist turn of the US and the escalating tariff war between the US and China.
Very, very interesting. I mean, I guess they will be broader than just trade. They could potentially get into a whole range of regulations. I mean, the obvious question is, this works in relation to, as you rightly said, other countries that respect, rules-based approaches. But there's a lot of talk about an EU-US trade agreement as coming out of this. And yet, you wonder how much value will that have? I mean, what's your view on the potential benefit to the EU in an economic security sense of negotiating some kind of trade deal with the US?
Well, I think what the EU has been doing so far is signaling a willingness to negotiate, or to at least sit at the table with the United States to discuss tariffs and counter tariffs. That's sensible. At the same time, I'm old enough to remember that Mexico and Canada thought that they could avoid US tariffs, and then 30 days later, whoops, there they were again. And so given that uncertainty, given that real sense of unpredictability of US trade policy at the moment, I would expect the EU not to think that a bilateral deal with the US is sufficient. And you can already see in more intense negotiations or discussions with Canada, with Mexico, with the Mercosur countries, with the key technology holders, so Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and whisper it or say it softly, but in some respects, we're moving towards a world where the G7 countries are going to start to work together without the United States and add a couple of other like-minded or key technology holding countries like South Korea or Brazil or India, even for that matter, to see how they can weather this Chinese-American storm.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, what you're saying is that this is a kind of unique US phenomenon at the moment in terms of the approach to US trade. We have 7 minutes left. I mean, we could go on for a long time, but what I'm going to do actually is ask each of you one question following up from your earlier comments, but I would be grateful if you could try and give I know it'd be a great answer, but a short and punchy answer. Nathan, could I just ask you, I mean, you talked about short-term economic prospects. What about the long-term economic prospects for the US? President Trump talks about reshoring, more investment. Same time, it could be US gets cut out of global supply chains for the very reasons that Ren was describing.
Great question. I think that fundamentally that the underlying U.S. economy is solid. So I'm hopeful that the innovation and the competitiveness and the resilience that we've seen over the last 5 years since the onset of the pandemic and the years afterward will over time reassert itself. But I think it's also fair to say that President Trump is stress testing that. Now, one other point, I was very taken by the phrase America Plus One. And the problem is that the U.S. offers goods producing firms around the world a unique source of demand. And I think that's precisely what President Trump is playing on in expecting and, in his view, incentivizing foreign firms to increase their investment in the United States. And that seems to me to be the big question about this policy over the longer term, is how do foreign firms respond to that? Do they increase their investment as he desires, or do they say, too much uncertainty, we just don't know, U.S. is a less reliable partner, and we're going to back away and maybe not sell as much stuff as we would otherwise. But the U.S. does offer something that's hard to replace elsewhere in the world, particularly with the consumer market.
Yeah, very, very important point. Yeah. DeAnne, actually, Nathan early on talked about the fact that the kind of deregulation element in the Trump strategy hadn't yet come to the fore, but could well do. Now, one element of that could be financial risk, not least because of just, unwinding things that were done after the global financial crisis, but also the new area of cryptocurrency and so on. From a central bank financial stability point of view, I mean, how worried are you about, if you like, the US becoming a new source of financial stability risk for the world economy?
I think financial risk is also up. Economic risk is up and financial risk is up. I think there are two particular areas that I'm sure their central bank will be looking at. One of them is just the degree of leverage, again, that's come through in the hedge fund side and the non-bank side of the financial markets, particularly with this very high frequency trading, leveraging up just a tiny spread between current and future prices. That basis point trade is really huge now. And we know from past financial crises, leverage is often the thing that causes the system either to freeze up or indeed for some markets to collapse. And the other thing that I think is quite worrisome is what eventually happens with cryptocurrency. There was a time when Trump was talking about buying up cryptocurrency as part of the U.S. Reserve, in essence making a false market in the things that people like Elon Musk and others are selling. So we don't have a good handle on cryptocurrencies at all, and I think it's really not something that most central banks want to promote at this point.
Yeah, understood. Janet, I mean, we talked earlier about sort of China as a potential source of demand, if you like, for the Chinese economy. What about China as a potential source of demand for the global economy? And we have seen, I think, the reduction in Chinese tariff barriers against quite a number of of emerging economies. This is kind of politically, diplomatically a good thing to do, but do you think it could have a real economic impact? So to some extent, China will become more of a driver for the global economy than in that demand sense than it has been hitherto.
Well, the thing is, in the past, China has been a strong destination for demand, but for investment goods. You know, it always used to be, if China was booming, you buy commodities, you buy Germany. And the difficulty if China is successful about, you know, having built out extraordinary amount of infrastructure, is that as it moves towards more of a consumer model, like most countries, you spend more on services than you do on goods. And in China's case, it makes all of the goods. Apart from, you know, a certain amount of luxury items. So back to Nathan's point, I've been inclined to agree with him that the US does offer the extraordinary consumer demand, and at the moment, I think those that might be hoping that suddenly the European consumer and the Chinese consumer are going to fill any hole that might be left by a sharp slowdown in US consumer demand for goods might be a little bit disappointed. I think, you know, China's seeking to become a bit more like the US, more internal demand, more consumer demand, but at the moment it has the production to meet most of that consumer demand for goods.
Thank you. Rem, I mean, you talked about the existing, if you like, European Union strategy and the sort of, as in Europe has done it, but Canada and India also are focusing on removing internal barriers and doubling down on the efficiency and effectiveness of their domestic economy. But one crucial element in the European Union story is the Savings and Investments Union, as we now call it, or the Capital Markets Union before. And I guess the key question is, to what extent does this new security stimulus actually mean that some of the barriers to creating that market, which we've seen in the past stall its progress, actually may now be overcome, and, you know, with actually potentially enormous benefits for the European Union economy?
Right, and this is the million-dollar question, at least, or €1,000,000 question in Brussels, that we've been talking about a capital markets union since 2009 or 2010, and it really hasn't moved forward. Is this new geopolitical environment, is it creating the external incentives to really deliver? Again, Mario Draghi in his report is very unequivocal about this. I think there are two questions connected to whether the Capital Markets Union is going to deliver. One is, what role, if any, can the UK play in this? I mean, we are also in a geopolitical environment where there is a growing realignment between the UK and the EU. The UK, of course, has a pretty deep financial market of its own to offer. Does that factor in? And secondly, and this is very controversial, particularly in Northern European countries, also the country I know best, the Netherlands, is there also, aside from private capital, any room for more public funding or even common assets or joint debt? And these, I think, are, you know, the questions that are live now. I mean, as an outsider, I would say if the Capital Markets Union doesn't produce any results in this environment, it never will.
Yeah. Rem, thank you very much. And sadly, we are out of time, but I'd like to, if you could join me in thanking all our panelists for some really great comments and insights on the US economy and its wider world implications. Thank you very much.